acknowledge it and accept that, and think about it and talk about it, rather than ignoring it. Because it's going to happen no matter what. You will find it in just about every group of any side, of any, once you get outside of like, a small group of people, like 20 people, something like that, 20, 30 people, you're going to begin to see this, where you're going to have people who take on leadership roles to make sure that the community thrives. It's just what they do. The other thing I want to talk about is the ocracies thing. Because there's this whole open source, we're all equals thing. I say that like it's negative, I don't mean that. But so there's this concept of a democracy, right? Like, we have had democracy in human culture for a long time. It has a lot of meanings to a lot of people. But at the end of the day, democracy is sort of, one voice, one vote. Each person gets to sort of have their say and have an impact on the community as a whole, and that those are basically equal. We are not a democracy. Now, in the open source world, people often say that we are a meritocracy in the open source world. So people who actually know stuff and accomplish things and earn merit also gain benefits from that. So in the open source world, that tends to mean that you get things like responsibilities and authority and those kinds of things. In other communities, it means you get money. You get, you get to have the best place for your hut, whatever. But there's a benefit to you earn merit, and then you are given some sort of benefit within that community. In open source, acknowledgement is a big benefit for some people. In the Drupal world, we say that we are a do-ocracy, that you don't even have to have merit, you don't have to have knowledge or skills to actually gain benefit. And it's the people who do things is how it gets done, not the people who know things getting things done. And that's kind of true, and I have definitely done so many presentations where that's what I preach. There's a lot of empowerment in that. Just trying to tell people, just do. Just go out and do. You don't even have to know what you're doing. Just do it. And, you're going to rock it. But I think that we do need to acknowledge there is meritocracy in our community. I think it's a good thing. I think it goes hand in hand with things like the core group and having levels of structure within the community. So I think you can't take just sort of a broad brushstroke and say we have do-ocracy and that's it. Because I think there's levels, right? So people don't get to the core group without some kind of merit. Like, they had to get there somehow. There's on one hand you're doing, but if they're doing the wrong thing that is damaging to the community or is diverging from the larger community interests, they're not going to stay in the core group that people will look up to and give authority to. But that's not to say that, like, in other parts of the community that we don't have more of a do-ocracy. And so I think you don't have to say that it's all one thing and that we all work this way. You can have smaller groups within the larger community that are a democracy. Democracy doesn't scale well. Especially like just straight up old school democracy. In our country, we have democracy, but it's representative democracy. Or else it would just sort of be a bit of mayhem. So there are levels of ocracy going on. There are structures that are happening in our community, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. And again, as things scale and communities get larger, you kind of have to have these things. It has to sort of work in that way over time. You just can't sort of have this, like, I don't know, fuzzy, I don't really know what's going on, everybody just does stuff and it's cool. You can say that, but that's not what's happening underneath. All right, third point, conflict. We all have it, we all know it, we all love it. I'm waiting for like something like blow up on the Twitter sphere for DrupalCon. Come on. We all like to watch it, as long as I'm not directly involved. One day, making tracks in the prairie of Prax, came a north-going Zax and a south-going Zax. I've always loved this Dr. Seuss story. So these are the two Zax. One walks north, one walks south. They run into each other. And neither one of them wants to get out of the way. And I'll prove to you, yelled the south-going Zax, that I can stand here in the prairie of Prax for 59 years, for I live by a rule that I learned as a boy back in south-going school. Never budge, that's my rule, never budge in the least. Not an inch to the west, not an inch to the east. I'll stay here, not budging, I can and I will, if it makes you and me and the whole world stand still. And what ends up happening in the story is they do. They stand there, and an entire like overpass and city builds around them, and they still stay exactly where they are. So that's the story of Zax. Conflict, you're gonna have it. One of the things I find interesting is that you have technical conflicts and social conflicts in software communities. And they don't necessarily run the same track in terms of how we deal with them. And by technical, I mean, I have a patch that does this code change, and you have a patch that does it that way. Fight, like, which one's the better way to go? There's a technical disagreement. And the way that those tend to be solved, of course it depends on what the technical disagreement is, but it really is, if it's straight up, generally the community will come to a consensus which one is the better technical solution. It might have to be because this was more performant than that one. Those kinds of things, right? I mean, it gets a lot more sort of technical in terms of its solution. But then we also have the social stuff. And, technical things can turn into social conflict if it gets personal. Looking at code is one thing, taking it to a personal level changes the entire flavor of it. And then sometimes we also just have pure social problems and conflicts in the community. I mean, we see this on a regular basis. We have like sort of our stuff that cycles through in terms of how we deal with, the big obvious ones are women, and we have this conversation regularly within our community on issues around that. But even things like, we had like the designers felt like they had to like have a revolution to become part of this community. And that was a social conflict. There wasn't anything technical that was going on there. Like, there's no disagreement about like, where this is and where that is in the code. That was a social disagreement. And so in terms of looking at conflict, guidelines is up there, because setting up norms for the community, everybody understanding what those norms and expectations are, helps when it comes to actually dealing with conflict. They don't avoid conflict, but they help you work your way through the conflict. And it's interesting because there are always rules. There are always rules in every community. And then it gets down to how often or in what way are you articulating those? Are you codifying those? So we now have a code of conduct in the Drupal community. And this was a pretty decently big deal. It wasn't something I was like, but we are at a size in our community where being able to articulate some basic ideas about how we want to behave and what this community is about is important because we have so many people. And again, it's not like that's going to make it so that nothing happens, like, the conflict doesn't happen. But what it comes down to is that people understand there's a way of expressing the conflict and that there are ways that we resolve that conflict. And so when it comes to those steps, you have that constitution sometimes called where it's like, this is what we're about. And if the conflict, if there's an obvious thing where like this is outside of what the overall goal of this community is, then you lose. But that gives a roadmap for how the community can resolve it. And so expression and resolution, we have issue queues. If people have a technical thing, there's a bug, or they think that doesn't work right, they can do that in the issue queue. They can express it, they can discuss it, and it can be worked out in the issue queue, typically. It's really interesting because we don't have a similar, that's a very tidy system. We don't have a similar system for social conflict. Social conflict goes into very interesting spaces in our community, often in Twitter. So we have, which is just great for conflict resolution. Just wow. It's like, I don't know, like Twitter plus conflict is like fireworks, like war zone kind of thing. It just like takes it, it escalates things to like the nth degree. But that's where we tend to, you'll see a lot of it come out there. You see stuff come out in personal blog posts. Sometimes social conflict comes out within the Drupal.org infrastructure, on groups.drupal.org, conversations that happen there, or conversations that happen in forums on Drupal.org. Typically, a whole bunch of stuff will happen if it's not one of these like really like overarching social conflicts that the community is still working with and through. But if it's a smaller like he said, she said, fist fight in the schoolyard kind of stuff, that will go to the webmasters queue perhaps and be like, hey, they said this, or they're doing, their module looked at me funny, that kind of thing. And it's like, oh god, okay. But that gets handled in like our webmasters queue or something like that. But it's interesting because we just don't really actually have, and I'm not even saying we need to, but it's just interesting to note that we don't really have any kind of standard way of allowing for the expression of social conflict. They just sort of tend to spurt out in various places, and people who happen to be in that place where it came out are the sort of first responders to actually deal with it. It's just interesting. And then as far as resolution, again, like issue queue, you go through, people say, this is the patch that's going in. Done. We win. And similarly, like that's the webmasters issue queue, kind of does a similar thing where we have some structure, like this is an issue within the community, we're going to take it here, and people are going to talk about it. People we've given authority, who actually have the authority to do things like block accounts or change ownership of modules. We're good. Damn. Really? Maybe I'll just leave it green. It's very Susie in color. Okay.